This is Impact Wrestling's Unbreakable Michael Elgin, and you're listening to the Wrestling Epicenter.
You're listening to Interactive Wrestling Radio, featuring the interactive interview, courtesy of WrestlingEpicenter.com.
Hey, how's it going, guys? This is TJP, otherwise known as the Phil M. Flash, otherwise known as the Cruiser Great, and you are listening to the Wrestling Epicenter.
You know, I just wish there was something to talk about. Welcome to another edition of Interactive Wrestling Radio right here on WrestlingEpicenter.com. My name is James Walsh, and damn is it good to be a wrestling fan right now. That's all I gotta say. You've got Impact Wrestling going to AXS TV as one of the big stories of the day, as well as, of course, their biggest pay-per-view of the year, Bound for Glory, happening in just about 10 days. Here we go with a great amount of stuff from Impact Wrestling, the company that always comes out the other end, and man, they always come out smelling like a rose. Or maybe like a maple leaf. Speaking of the maple leaf, of course, I'm speaking of the Canadian superstar who's an incredible athlete and will be in one of the featured matches at Bound for Glory. He is Michael Elgin, who's taking on Marufuji. He'll be having that match at Bound for Glory on October 20th on pay-per-view, so be sure and order that event. Also, check out All Glory the night before, and check out ImpactWrestling.com for all that great information. Hope everybody enjoys our interview here today with Mr. Michael Elgin. I also loved, by the way, seeing Johnny Swinger, a guy we interviewed back in July before he was a blip on the radar again of the wrestling circuit. And now look at him, he's on Impact Wrestling. Don't really dig the shot that got taken about his theme music. There ain't nothing wrong with Skid Row and Warrant. Works okay for the Allure and in Ring of Honor. I'm just saying. And if Dawkins' Into the Fire could be the NWA's theme song, hey, I think we're okay for some hair metal in wrestling in 2019. Not as much of a joke as I think they intended. Anyway, hope everybody enjoys. I'm so glad, by the way, for Johnny Swinger to get this opportunity at this stage of the game. He's 44 years old. He's in great shape, a great athlete, always been a great worker, always been a nice guy. I've kept in contact with him loosely on Facebook, interviewed him 15 plus years ago. So good for Johnny Swinger to get back in a major company in 2019, going into 2020, got a new 2-year deal. A news story we actually broke because he contacted me and said, hey, you'll never believe what I just did. I signed with Impact. Awesome. My favorite wrestling company signs one of my favorite guys in the business. I love it. Check out Impact Plus, ImpactWrestling.com, and more. And, of course, check out our archives. But for now, let's get to Michael Elgin right here on the Wrestling Epicenter.
This is Johnny Swinger, and you are in the Wrestling Epicenter, so don't sing it, swing it.
Like what you're hearing? Follow us on social media. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/Wrestling Epicenter, or just search Wrestling Epicenter in the search box on Facebook. On Twitter at WEpicenter. On YouTube at IWR Interactive. And of course, check us out at WrestlingEpicenter.com, your hub and home of all things professional wrestling interviews. We're the originals, and we love what we do.
This is Josh Matthews, and you are in the Wrestling Epicenter.
Welcome back to Interactive Wrestling Radio. On the Newsmaker line with us right now is an Impact Wrestling superstar. Gentleman who joined us just a few months ago, but he has been doing big things since then. Of course, I'm speaking of Michael Elgin. Mr. Elgin, are you with me?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you back on. So just last night on AXS TV, it kind of is a time warp. It's funny to think that it's already been almost 6 months, but they replayed Rebellion, where you made your Impact Wrestling debut. Can't believe that's been 6 months ago already.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't feel that long.
Very good. And I mentioned it was on AXS TV. Of course, that's the new home of Impact Wrestling for new content starting just after Bound for Glory. As a guy in the locker room, what does it mean to you guys to have a much larger TV reach than you did when you first joined the company?
I think it's huge because I really stand firmly behind the fact that Impact Wrestling TV has been amazing. And that goes back before I even was part of the company. As a fan watching, I really enjoyed the product, and that's one of the things that made me want to join the company. And now that more eyes get to view it, I think it's just going to be amazing because, the roster is young, they're talented, they're hungry, and everybody wants to be at their A game. So I think that more viewers, people are going to be even more ready to work their butts off. And I'll tell them this to their face, and if they're listening to this podcast, that I can guarantee you I'm going out there like I have every night since I've debuted, and that's having the best match possible. So please try to have a better match than me.
Very good. Sami Callihan has said for months, don't sleep on Impact Wrestling, and it kind of feels like, you know what, this kind of proves him right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So in that debut that we mentioned, you tangled with Brian Cage, who you were kind of married to for a few months there. You guys were going around the corner. Of course, he was dealing with his injuries. Thoughts looking back at your feud with Brian Cage?
I think it was the perfect way for me to come into the company. I think that I was a much different opponent stylistically for Brian than what he's been showcasing since he was, chasing the world championship, and since he's been world champion, even though he's been dealing with injuries, like you said. I think I was like the perfect mix of everything he needed to really have that blowout match as champion, and I think we succeeded with that. And I think it really kind of made people that maybe weren't familiar with me kind of open their eyes to exactly how I wrestle and what I represent as a wrestler.
I would agree. And from Brian Cage, you almost immediately went over to feuding with Rhino, who pretty much stepped in your way from winning that title at Slammiversary. Rhino's a great signing for Impact Wrestling because he's an older guy who's been around. He's a veteran, but he also can still go. What is your thoughts on Rhino?
I think you hit the nail on the head. He's a very experienced competitor that can still go and put some eyes on us that might not be paying attention if they're not familiar with any of the names they read when they see Impact Wrestling results. So he's been a great addition, and I think that moving forward, a guy like Rhino, especially moving over to AXS TV, if you see a commercial for the show or you hear about it and you see or hear the name Rhino, then it makes you maybe want to tune in, and then you get to see the younger, newer talent that is just blowing the roof off of places.
I agree. So leading into Slammiversary, I interviewed Sami Callihan, and I had no idea that they were going to go on last. I just assumed in my head, you guys, the main event would be the world title match, as it typically is. Intergender wrestling, though, took the main stage, took the main event spot, something you're very familiar with, intergender wrestling, that is. What did you think of Impact Wrestling putting intergender wrestling up in the main event spot?
So I'm kind of torn between that. There's multiple reasons why I'm torn, because in one fact, I think that a company that's like Impact Wrestling putting an intergender match at the forefront is great. I think that Tessa is one of the best wrestlers, male or female, in the world. But I feel that myself and Brian Cage should have been a main event at Slammiversary, and that's not a knock on Tessa. That's not a knock on Sami. That's not a knock on the decision that Impact made. I just felt from April to July, the main story that the company went with was myself against Brian. And then if you look at the match, I think that was very fitting for a main event match on a big pay-per-view. So to me, I feel that we should have main evented. But in the same token, I'm happy that the main event went to Tessa and Sami because, like I said, being a company like Impact and putting intergender wrestling at the forefront and having a special talent like Tessa in the main event, you can't go wrong.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, you mentioned in a company like Impact where this is the big times now. You're talking about not a independent. This is a big-time promotion. What do you think of intergender wrestling breaking into it like that? And I'll tell you a story out of school, not to name drop, but I interviewed Rob Van Dam a few months ago, and he pretty much said, ain't no way he's doing intergender wrestling. So is there still a lot of that, maybe hesitation from the men to involve themselves in such kind of things?
I think there's going to definitely be some hesitation. And you know what? I don't mind intergender wrestling, but I also think that, like anything, there is a poor way to present intergender wrestling. And that's not anything bad. I just think that some matchups people try to do within intergender wrestling don't work for various reasons. But for the most part, I think intergender wrestling is great. I think it attracts a different audience. I think it makes the female competitors even more viable. And not to say they weren't, but I feel like wrestling had that kind of stigma for so many years that female wrestlers were only good for their looks and stuff, and their talent was kind of downplayed in North America. And obviously more recently, there's been a push for female wrestling, which has been amazing, and they're great competitors and great athletes, but even more so moving up a notch, having them wrestle the men is showing that not only do they feel they're good enough to get a spotlight against each other, but they're equally as talented and equally as important to the men in wrestling, which I feel is very important to showcase.
I said I wasn't going to name drop anymore, and I promise I won't after this one. A few weeks ago, I interviewed Davey Boy Smith Jr., and I mentioned your phrase that you gave us in our last interview about New Japan, where you said that you're no longer the new toy. That's part of the reason why you weren't getting used as much. And he loved it. He thought that was the perfect way to put it. I think he's probably going to start using it himself. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, and again, it's not like a bitterness to where I hate New Japan. It just, I saw the writing on the wall. And that's just how they present their company. And many people do that, But I just felt that it was going to take too long for them to realize what I could bring to the table again. And not that I think they forgot it. I just, as I said, they get new toys and they kind of see what they bring to the table. And the longer they do that, the old toys that really know what's happening sit in the background. And I just knew that I could offer more. And I think I proved that when I went over for Big Japan and they had their biggest audience in almost 10 years. And we got the cover of the magazine, and we sold the most amount of T-shirts they've ever sold for an event, and all these things, shown that I really had great support in the country of Japan. And my hat's off to New Japan. Obviously, they're an amazing company and doing great things, but it was definitely time to move on.
Very good, very good. All right, so here we are. We're heading into Bound for Glory, and you're going to be facing somebody from Japan. You're going to be facing Marufuji. Sorry, that's how my wife says it. She's English. Marufuji. You're going to be facing Marufuji in the match at Bound for Glory. What about the matchup with Marufuji? Yeah, I got it right that time. Appeals to you?
I've been saying it time and time again. I was always a fan of Japanese wrestling since a young age. And when I began my career in 2003 was kind of when the Japanese wrestlers were kind of coming back to the States, because there was a long time where they weren't really predominant in the U.S. And the two biggest and most known names that were coming over to the States most frequently were Marufuji and Kenta. And a lot of people were Kenta fans, but myself, I was a Marufuji fan, and I just thought he was amazing. And my goal in 2003 when I started was actually to go over to Japan for Pro Wrestling Noah. And I had even attended a Harley Race camp that did, a tryout for Noah and stuff like that. Like, that was my goal, because I was a fan of All Japan Wrestling growing up, and guys like Masawa and Kobashi moved over, and then you had the new guys coming up. like Marufuji, and he was somebody I always wanted to wrestle. And then in 2013, I was supposed to wrestle him for Ring of Honor, but he ended up getting hurt in Japan before he could make the trip, and it never happened. So ever since then, I've been, just waiting for the opportunity to wrestle him, and now I finally get it.
Very good, very good. Now, if you watch Impact back, the commentary, they were trying to draw parallels between your match with TJP, which, by the way, that was a great match, just to throw the compliment your way, between TJP and Marufuji. Do you find that there is going to be similarities between the two styles?
Yes and no. TJ can strike, but he's more so went to the ground game now. But he's still a deadly striker, and that's something I have to watch out with for Marufuji. I think they're very similar in stature, and the difference of, strength and speed is going to be very similar to myself and Marufuji. But I think the one thing that TJ learned, the fans learned, and Marufuji is going to learn at Bound for Glory is sometimes you might think you have a speed advantage against me, but you don't really have that same advantage you would against somebody else my size. So as much as there's similarities, I think there was also a learning lesson for Marufuji to think that some of his game plan isn't going to work coming to Chicago.
Very cool, very cool. So big things on the horizon for Impact Wrestling, as we already talked about their transition over to AXS TV. Certainly more eyeballs will be on the product than there have been. At least the availability for that is there. So what's your thought on wrestling where we are now with the debut of, I got to use the letters, AEW on TNT, with WWE moving to Fox, and now, of course, Impact now moving to AXS TV to keep up with the Joneses? What do you think of all this going on and the state of wrestling in 2019 going into 2020?
Man, I think this is an unprecedented time. It really is. Like, you have, like you said, AEW on TNT. You have WWE on Fox. You have NXT on the USA Network. You have Impact moving to Access. You have New Japan on Access. You have WOW on Access. You have NWA and MLW on YouTube. This is literally an unprecedented time in pro wrestling, that there's so many avenues to watch so many different talents from so many different places. And not only that, the success of New Japan and them being on American television, and then them being able to come to the States. And I think that's opening up more eyes to Japanese wrestling as a whole. So like companies like Pro Wrestling Noah are even getting more eyes on it. Like, if you ever want to be a pro wrestler, 2019 moving into 2020 is definitely the time to be one.
You mentioned 2003. Looking back at 2003, when there was no options, or at least not as many, Ring of Honor was very small. Impact was, Wednesday night pay-per-views. It's got to be amazing for you to see where we've come.
Oh, my God. It's night and day.
Absolutely. All right, so Bound for Glory is coming up here on the 20th. Can't wait to see your match with Marufuji, but I got to ask one last question. Since the title picture didn't quite go your way earlier this summer, here we are going into 2020. And Johnny Impact gave me a line. He said, no, I want to become a curtain jerker when I asked this before. But do you still have your sights set on the top of the card on the World Heavyweight Championship?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the way Slammiversary ended, you tell me, when was the last time you saw a physical champion, a champion that looks like Brian Cage, beat somebody with a roll-up? It was a fluke. And for anybody to say anything otherwise would be silly. So to me, I'm still standing here the uncrowned champion. And it just sucks for either Brian Cage or Sami Callihan that after Bound for Glory, that's my sole focus. They're just lucky that I found out Marufuji was coming stateside, because if he wasn't, I would have been fighting Sami and Brian Cage.
Sounds great. All right, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we look forward to next weekend. It's not just Bound for Glory. It's also All Glory the night before on Impact Plus. Lots of great stuff going on for Impact Wrestling in the next 10 to 12 days. So everybody out there, check out Bound for Glory on pay-per-view, and, of course, get it on Impact Plus, too.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much for having me.
You, too. I'll let you get on to probably the next one. You doing a lot of these today?
I had quite a few before. I think this is done because I literally timed it, so I worked out, and then as soon as I was done at the gym, I started the interview. So I'm hoping to get a meal in before anybody else calls me.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll let you get your meal. Thank you so much for your time today.
No problem whatsoever. Thank you.
Hey, it's Tony Schiavone, and you're listening to the Wrestling Epicenter. And I would stick around, but I'm desperately out of time.